Let's do it.
Alrighty, and I will go ahead and share. There we go.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Carolyn, for setting us up with that beautiful shot of Sangiacomo Vineyards. My name is Joe Spellman, Master Sommelier for Justin and Landmark Wines. I actually reside in Chicago, which was my longtime restaurant home. But in my post-restaurant life, I've enjoyed working with a lot of great vineyards up and down the California coast and other places, and have had the chance to get to know quite a few of our different spots where we grow great fruit to make great wine. And one of them is Sangiacomo Family Vineyards. We're very excited this evening to present, along with Steve Sangiacomo and Jeffrey Gold, 3 vintages of the Sangiacomo Vineyard Chardonnay made at Landmark. That's me in a corny shot somebody took at a winery event, a wine, I think it was called SomCon. Not that a sommelier would try to con you, but it was a convention of sommeliers. We're always interested in value and always interested in food harmony. And that's something I might address a little bit later. But I'm very excited to be able to taste these 3 vintages, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And we hope you have them all ready and at your disposal, but not ice cold or in the fridge anymore. I think it's ideal to have these really well-made Chardonnays at a little bit warmer temperature than the kind of refrigerator temp we get used to in restaurants and our own home. They show a lot more that way. And as we go through the tasting over the next hour or so, I think you'll see a lot of changes in the aromas and flavors of the wine. If you only have one glass, that's fine. And you want to taste through and keep yourself from having to wash too many glasses. You can do them in this sequence. If you have 3 glasses in front of you, all the better. You can go back and forth, comparing and contrasting and finding nuance of each vintage. And I think with Steve and Jeffrey here, we'll be able to talk about maybe some of the reasons why the wines might be different. I think that's part of the fun of a vertical tasting like this, working with 3 vintages. If you've got your bottles, got them uncorked and got them ready to taste, you might as well start sipping. And if you don't know Landmark, this is a very brief timeline of our legacy going back to the 70s, when the winery was originally begun at a different location, now located in Kenwood off Adobe Canyon Road, and sourcing from all over Sonoma and even beyond, other great places where Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are grown. But those are, of course, our 2 primary varieties at Landmark. The relocation occurred in the late 80s when Damaris Dear Ford was in full charge of the operations and brought in a great winemaker, Helen Turley, as a consulting enologist, who worked with Eric Stern and then eventually Greg Stock, who worked with Eric for several years before becoming named as the head winemaker in 2011. We're sorry that Greg couldn't be with us, but I think we're going to have some great commentary about the wines. Maybe not so much about wine making, but about wine growing, which is what this is all about. We started working with Sangiacomo some years ago. I think Steve and Jeffrey may have a little more background on that. I thought the original Sangiacomo vineyard label designated or vineyard designated wine was 2012, but I could be wrong about that. And I know we had worked with it for several years in the Damaris Reserve wine as well. And I think Steve was saying earlier, maybe over 20 years of some legacy with working with Sangiacomo fruit. So great vineyard and series of different sites in Carneros that we're going to focus on today. We're really thrilled that you're with us and we can talk a little bit more in detail about Sonoma, the lay of the land, the growing conditions of 3 different vintages, and they were quite different from one another. And we're going to show you a little bit more about Sonoma and the site, and then some real great detail in videos about the vineyards. Now, if you know Sonoma County, and I know some of you are local, you probably know it better than I do, although I've been coming here for 35 plus years on and off as a fan. In fact, I visited Landmark in the old location back in the early 80s, believe it or not.
Wow.
Don't have any pictures though, sorry to say. But yes, we speak about Sonoma in general terms, but it's over 1 million acres of land. And it's subdivided into some 17 AVAs. Those are American Viticulture, AVA, American Viticultural Areas, each of which has a distinctive set of definitions of sometimes elevation, certainly of soil type, proximity to water, and there's some relationship to climate. And Sonoma, northern Sonoma and inland Sonoma is quite different from coastal Sonoma or southern Sonoma, where Carneros is. You see that circled yellow in the lower right. That is the part of Carneros that is in Sonoma. It is a greater part of it than it is in Napa, but it's kind of an unusual AVA in that it contains acreage on both sides in both counties. What's the advantage of Carneros? It's a bit cooler, quite a bit cooler than a lot of the rest of Sonoma. And because of wind patterns, which we'll show you more about later, and fog, and as I drove across the bay today, it was quite foggy. It's a pretty amazing difference from what you see in a lot of the rest of Sonoma. The Petaluma Gap, wind gap, is very important wind pressure area as well. It's quite south of where the Landmark location is. Landmark's winery, if you don't know, is on Highway 12 and Adobe Canyon Road in the Sonoma Valley. And then our other property where you can visit and taste, and a great property in its own right, is the Hop Kiln Estate over in the Russian River. That'll be for a whole different tasting. We'll talk more about Hop Kiln, but that's a fantastic site and we're doing some great things there. So what's the big deal about Carneros? Well, it's a cool area, so it supports cool climate varieties like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Bits and pieces of other varieties too, like Pinot Gris. There's some Merlot in the area. But a lot of this was established years ago to produce sparkling wine. There's some really good sparkling wine producers either in the region or sourcing from the region in other parts of North Coast. But the sparkling wine, why? Because it's an area that's cool and the grapes retain acidity very nicely. It rolls pretty well. A lot of it is fairly flat, as we'll see, but there's some pitch to the land. And the primary soil type, which is something that geeks a lot of us out who are about terroir and other dirty French words like that, a lot of clay. And that's because it's all old underwater, kind of muddy river basin or water basin. And so those are interesting soils, and we can talk a little bit later about some of the complexities that gives us. A lot of acreage in the overall AVA, of which about 10,000 acres are planted. The majority of that, as I said, is in Sonoma, at least for grapes. And then the Sangiacomo holdings, I think this might be a non-updated slide, are actually about 1,200 acres under Sangiacomo family control in the Sonoma, in the Carneros district, with other acreage in other parts of the North Coast, which maybe Steve can talk about a little bit later too. We go to our next slide. I think we're going to give you a good impression as we kind of fly in this Google Earth video over California. You see the Central Valley there, quite a bit east of the regions we're talking about in Sonoma. And that red line represents that low-lying area. That's the saddle in the hills that creates the Petaluma wind gap, along with the other line, which is now moving to the right, which represents cool air patterns that come off San Pablo Bay. That's very, very important to this growing area, as we'll see. As we fly in over into the Carneros district specifically, we'll give it a different perspective of the Sangiacomo family cluster of estates, which have been developed over several decades. And again, a lot of family history we can talk about too. There's the San Pablo Bay effect. Of course, Google Earth doesn't show us fog, and it's very hard to show wind in a video, but that's where a lot of that comes through, and it's fairly flat down there across that fairly muddy, marshy area. But to the interior, quite a great set of vineyard sites throughout this part of Carneros. And as we overlook some of the buildings on the Sangiacomo estate, you see that convergence of those two red lines that represent those wind patterns. And then we're going to fly a little more closely into very specific places from which the grapes that you are tasting this evening, come. And maybe Jeffrey, I can hand it over to you to talk a little bit more specifically about those.
Yeah, if we could go back to that Google Earth image.
We might have to run through the whole thing again.
Run through the whole thing again.
And then pause it.
The rectangles that were shown last, the Sangiacomo Vineyard Chardonnay comes from a particular block, vintage after vintage. The 2020 vintage had the addition of another vineyard source from the Sangiacomos, the home ranch. But for my 10 years that I've been here at Landmark, the Keyser Ranch, and it's the white rectangle kind of up and to the right, is the source for the three wines that we're tasting over three vintages. And one of the really unique things about that block, and then the block that's immediately to the left of it, is the clone that's been planted there by the Sangiacomos. And it's the old Wente clone. And it is more of a winemaker's clone than a grower's clone. And what I mean by that is the winemakers love the lower yields, the sometimes incomplete clusters, or what I call chicks and hens or peas and pumpkins, the difference in berry sizing. And with the smaller berries, sometimes they become, or through the growing season, they're seedless. They've never established a seed in the embryo. And another thing that I really enjoy about these three wines and their fruit source is during the growing season, working with the Sangiacomos, and then when it comes time to do the grape sampling, following the evolution of the fruit flavors that wine grapes can produce. They're much like a chameleon. You look at it, but it might not be what you're seeing. And I remember early on at the other winery that I worked at before Landmark, tasting grapes and seeing this evolution of fruit flavors. When they're unripe, they're green. With Chardonnay, it might be unripe pear or Granny Smith apple. And as we get more sugar development, we start seeing less acid in the analysis. Then we start getting into a little more riper stone fruit, peaches, pears, nectarines. And in a lot of vintages, we come out with tropical flavors. And I think pineapple, for me, is one of the dominant flavors of the fruit in the vineyard.
Delicious. Yeah, I'm sipping the 2018. I find exactly what you're talking about, some of that stone fruit character and really great acidity, nice balance, and a wine that has a great energy to it. I think that's important to find in a Chardonnay. So Sangiacomo, Steve, I know you have a lot more to say about it, about the properties and the family. I pillaged a few key points here from the Sangiacomo website that tell some of the story, but of course, I'm sure it's much more complex than this. Why don't you tell us about your family and how you got into grapes and how that's become so important to the wine world that we are all enjoying.
Well, thanks, Joe. Thank you, Jeffrey, as well. I'm honored to be here, representing the family. And, we're a multi-generational family business that's been farming. Actually, August 30th coming up, we'll be celebrating 95 years farming in Sonoma County. So my grandfather came over in 1927, fruit trees, fruit orchards, pears and apples, and quickly, developed a family. To be a multi-generational family, you needed kids to do all the work. So he had three sons, my father Angelo, and then we have our Aunt Lorraine as well. And so we grew to be one of the largest pear growing families in businesses in Northern California. We planted our first wine grapes, Green Acres, in 1969, which Landmark has been getting fruit from that vineyard for a number of years. And we actually go back selling fruit to Landmark in the mid 90s. So when Eric Stern was there in 89, started there in 89, 92, I think our first vintage was 1995 was our first vintage. I think you're right, Joe. The first Vineyard Desert was 2012, but I think a lot of our fruit had gone into Damaris Reserve previously. So their Landmark is one of our longest vineyard winery relationships. We sell to over 70 wineries. We're very proud of that, and Landmark's right at the top for long-term relationships, going back to the Calhoun's days of, the joke is obviously there's a lot of John Deere legacy with the Landmark Calhoun family, as you alluded to, but we had a lot of Kubota tractors back in the day. So I think my dad and uncles are afraid for them to see our tractor fleet when Eric would come out to see the vineyards. But so we planted wine grapes in 1969, and then we convert all our pear trees over to vineyards in 1980 in the early 80s. And so it was kind of as the wine industry grew, we grew with it. Today we farm in Carneros, 1,200 acres across 12 different vineyards right here that are outlined beautifully here with our Carneros map. We do farm in the Petaluma Gap, which Landmark does get a couple vineyards, our Lakeville blocks in our Lakeville vineyard. And we do have a vineyard in Robert Trout in the Petaluma Gap as well. But Carneros Sonoma Valley is our home. It's our foundation. And, we've been here for almost a century, and we're just proud of being growers of the Landmark family.
Great, thank you. We probably want to dig a little deeper and talk specifically about Keyser, since that's an important component of this wine, as I think we've repeated a couple things, but we have a really beautiful drone, I guess, produced footage here coming in.
Yeah, so this is a beautiful drone vintage. This is our Keyser vineyard with our Keyser little reservoir there. So Keyser quickly became one of Greg's favorites. Green Acres was at the top of the list, but in 2000, this block that Jeffrey noted earlier is a foundation. It's like the core of Greg's, I think, Sangiacomo vineyard vineyard portfolio. It's kind of become, his favorite, as everyone has, just like across our vineyards, we all have our favorites. It's amazing how many winemakers we sell to, how so many of them have their little favorites. It's like picking your favorite kid. Sometimes you can do it, sometimes you can't. But I think Greg's picked his favorite kid, and that's Keyser Vineyard. And that 07, Greg they've been getting fruit since the first fruit in 2011 was the first actually vintage that actually fruit was produced off it. And Greg's been getting fruit and Landmark ever since then. So it's a beautiful vineyard. And you mentioned a lot of clays. The interesting thing about a lot of our properties, see all these creeks, or Sonoma Creek, Fowler Creek, Roger Creek. So we have a lot of beautiful topsoil alluvial loam that really kind of allows for some distinction among our vineyards across Carneros compared to other. We do have some clay sites, but a lot of the Keyser and Home Ranch and Green Acres is a beautiful alluvial clay loam with very well drained soils.
We should point out, I know Jeffrey talked in our preliminary meeting about that fog bank coming over those hills. That's a beautiful site.
And that's great. You can see San Pablo Bay to the south. We like to say Carneros is the best of both worlds. We get the fog and marine influence from San Pablo Bay, but we also get that coastal influence out by Bodega Bay that comes rushing in the afternoon. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. We get kind of a dual maritime influence that really allows for that, great natural acidity that allows for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir to flourish here in Carneros.
Yeah, it's a great site. And there is a bit of a tilt to this, isn't it? I drove by earlier today just to sort of have a look for myself. And it's not a totally flat vineyard the way it more or less appears here.
Yeah, there's rolling hills. Yeah, definitely rolling hills. I mean, that reservoir, I tell you, right, I feel like jumping in that reservoir right now, seeing that. It's still 90 here. So, there's definitely, Carneros is made up of a lot of rolling hills. I mean, obviously not a lot of steep hillsides, but tons of rolling hills that allows for kind of that ideal drainage and that kind of ideal sun exposure that some of those rolling slopes will give you.
As described here, right? And this shows the multiple different blocks of, I guess, primarily Chardonnay, some Pinot, a couple other.
Yeah, so there's definitely, our vineyard holdings, we're 1,600 total in Sonoma County. We have about 2/3 Chardonnay and 1/3 Pinot Noir. And the reason why people get why do we have so much Chardonnay? One is I love Chardonnay. We all love Chardonnay. It's the number one planted variety in Sonoma County and most of the world for a reason, because it's just it's so fresh and bright, and it can excel, and it's very terroir focused. I think you mentioned that earlier, Joe. It's very terroir focused. You can really taste the soil, all the elements that each vineyard brings in distinction. It can be very distinctive. And also Landmark's a perfect example. When we were, growing our, vineyard portfolio in the 80s and 90s, I mean, we partnered with a lot of brands that really focused on Chardonnay, and we kind of grew with them. And as they needed more fruit, we planted more, Chardonnay. And so, Pinot Noir is an amazing variety that, our Sonoma County is well renowned for. And, but Chardonnay kind of, it leads the charge in a lot of ways.
No doubt. And certainly, as you say, the key variety for Carneros for sure, as well as, I think supplying so many wineries with that great cooler climate fruit makes it a great table wine and restaurant wine. I mean, I know the Sangiacomo name for several decades myself, because several wineries have used Sangiacomo fruit and honored the winery with those special designations. I also note here that it's a certified sustainable vineyard. Maybe you could address that a little bit. What that
Yes. Yeah.
really, I mean, minimizing inputs is important to keep that soil doing its job.
Yeah, so we're proud. Sonoma County as a region is the most sustainable wine region in the world. Over 99% of all of the vineyards in Sonoma County are certified under a sustainable program, whether it's CSWA, which is the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, which we're part of, but there's SIP, there's Fish Friendly Farming. There's a couple others that do it as well. So all of our 99% of vineyards in Sonoma County are certified under one of those programs. Our vineyards have been certified since 2015. It's a program that allows us to continually assess our vineyard. It's kind of getting a test on our vineyard every year to make sure we pass, make sure we're audited. So everything we say, and it's an encompassing program that is obviously how we treat the environment is in our vineyards, and what we do is vitally important. But the nice thing about this CSWA program, it's a holistic approach. So we're looking about how we run our business, how we treat our employees, which is number one. Employees are number one for all of our businesses. And then also what we do in the community, how we give back and support the community that's so vital and dear to our businesses.
That's an important part of sustainability that a lot of people don't think about, is taking care of people, your human relations, your community relations. I know it's important at Justin. We're part of SIP at Justin, which you mentioned. And, I think more and more attention is being paid on responsible agriculture, water use, of course, and minimizing any inputs that could be deleterious to health or the health of the farm. And it's a pretty big property. I think is it the largest or second largest of the different named holdings in the Sangiacomo family group?
You're talking Joe? You're talking over just our vineyard. For our vineyards, Sangiacomo vineyards, we're one of the larger family operations in Sonoma County. There's a handful of others, and for us, it's it's a component of all their different vineyards, and that we've a lot of them have been. A lot of leased land. There's a lot of leased land in Sonoma County. So a lot of them are partnerships with other families that we've leased over, the decades. And so, it's important for us to, of all the vineyards that, Keyser's a perfect example where it's the old Keyser family that it's the old Keyser dairy that we have a lot of namesake vineyards that we kind of named the vineyard after the previous owners and kind of testament and heritage to them.
Right. That's a great property. The wine speaks for itself. And we're tasting these three vintages. I hope everybody's tasting along with us. This is a still shot, and again, featuring the reservoir, the tree line there along the creek, I presume, and then that fog bank out to the west.
Yep, coming in the Petaluma Gap.
Right. Now, here's a great photo. I think, Jeffrey, we talked about this the other day, how the almost translucence of the variety is very important in helping identify quality. And that chicks and hens idea, different size berries on the cluster. It's so typical, isn't it, of the Wente clone?
Yeah, it really is getting that uneven size bearing. And like I talked about earlier, seedless grapes. And really the only way that you can see that they're seedless, if you're not popping them in your mouth and finding it out, is one thing that I really enjoy about my role here at Landmark, not only as grower relations manager, but also being the point person for Greg and going out and doing the maturity monitoring and sampling. And I love going to Sangiacomo and having that my first vineyard in the morning and catching the sunrise there. And when you get the clusters backlit by the sun, it's incredible. Yeah, it sounds simple, but it's very exciting because I know what the potential is going to be.
Beautiful. And there is a sense of place. I think you see a through line with all three of these vintages. Well, I just had a few notes here on the winemaking, aside from obviously the grape growing, which is, some would say 90% of winemaking. Maybe some winemakers will disagree with me, but I've often heard even really great winemakers say the most important decision made in a vineyard is the picking date, making sure you're getting the fruit in at the right level of ripeness, not overripe, not too acidic and green. And so I think getting all that fruit in at the right time, and sometimes we'll have multiple days in the vineyard and picking different lots.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all made the same way though. So in our notes on the winemaking, you guys press the clusters to get juice, to start fermenting, and settle that juice off the solids. And then we rack into barrel. And historically, pretty typically, we're about 35% new French barrels, the remainder second and third year barrels, French barrels only at Landmark for the fermentation of our Chardonnays. We use only the yeast that comes in with the vineyard, as we call it, indigenous yeast or native yeast, and always ferment it completely dry. I'm sure you're experiencing that kind of snap in the back palate. This is a very important technique used in Burgundy that we employ as well, that is lees stirring during and post fermentation, even for the full year that it's in barrel, year plus, to give a little more texture to the wine. And also because it goes through 100% malolactic, that lees stirring, being in contact with the lees, minimizes some of those diacetyl or butter-like aromas that we kind of want to avoid in good Chardonnay. And we don't filter the wine. Once it's all settled in the barrel and racked a couple of times, it can be bottled directly from barrel, and minimal inputs even at that point, just to keep the wine true to type, true to style, true to place. And that's been the case for several years in all of Landmark's Chardonnay making. And I think that is a big quality standard that Greg has continued to employ. I don't think there's really been any exceptions that I know of. Certainly there are challenges in some vintages, and we'll get to that in a moment as we talk about these three. Jeffrey or Steve, anything else you'd like to say about the fruit?
I think one thing that's really important that you hit on is the harvest decision making. And I feel that my role is to try and support Greg as much as I can by doing the sampling and bringing the clusters back so he has some juice to taste and we run the analysis on it. And I know that once we start getting close to him making that picking decision at Keyser Block 072A for this wine, he doesn't need me to go out anymore. So it's a little bit bittersweet. He's going to be the last one in the block. Maybe it's 2 more sampling data points, maybe it's 3, but I appreciate that he is always the last one in the block, and that's helping him make his harvest decision. tasting the fruit in the field, bringing his sample back and running the analysis on it. And with confidence, he makes his harvest decisions.
Steve, I'm kind of curious, do you get involved in any of the conversations about what the vineyard conditions are like, or do any measurements or analysis the way Jeffrey?
Oh, yeah.
Do?
I mean, we're constantly checking. Greg, Jeffrey, come pick this stuff. It's ready. It's ready. No,
2 more days.
It's ready. It's ready. Come get it. No, I mean,
2 more days.
What's that?
2 more days.
Few more days, exactly.
Yeah, 2 more days.
Same thing. I mean, having worked with the Landmark team with Greg, and obviously Greg for 2 decades, and Jeffrey almost a decade, and even across all of our probably we have sold over 40 wine Chardonnay clients, is how the decision making has evolved from a style standpoint, I guess. I mean, that's my takeaway in the last decade of how we're just, as a California industry, we're picking. We already have the California sunshine. We love the ripeness, but just how we're making decisions made to really kind of combine the both, that Christmas and acidity. And that's what I've seen in these 18, 19, and 20 vintage, is you get that beautiful California ripeness with that acidity and that brightness that comes from the vineyard, obviously, but also I think winemakers have been very aware and cognizant of not really losing that acidity that we're so fortunate to have, along with the ripeness. So I know that's why we haven't had to push this. Maybe 7, 8 years ago, it was, all right, guys, it's time. And now it's, the winemakers are very aware and cognizant to pick it on the freshness side.
Hey, gentlemen, I just got a really great question actually directed at me. And it's from Jocelyn, and she wants to know what's a telltale sign that it's a good date to pick harvest or a bad date to pick the grapes?
Sunday is always a bad day. Greg likes to have a relaxing Sunday, whether he's here at the winery dealing with fruit that's already been harvested and fermenting, but we don't like to get the crush pad dirty on Sundays.
And he likes it at 7:30, not 7 o'clock. He doesn't like it too early. He doesn't like it too late. He wants it at 7:30 so he can get his Starbucks coffee, right, Jeffrey, or something.
Yeah. I mean, it all works wonderfully. Whatever Greg's strategy is, vintage after vintage, it works. And I appreciate that.
You bring a great point up, Steve. And I know we say this in our technical notes, but all the fruit that we harvest is brought in. I mean, the harvest starts when it's still dark out, right? I'm at 4 a.m. or something. So, to get it into the winery cold by 7 o'clock, I think that's an important quality point that, especially when you're wanting to hold acids and keep the fruit clean. Really,
yeah, that's it, Joe. That's a great point. All of our fruit, I'd say 70% of it's picked at night where it's cold and fresh. I mean, we're even a big component to our, as a vineyard, operation and brand supporting all these wineries, is making sure the fruit gets picked at the optimal time. So we will actually, Greg can attest and Jeffrey can attest that he'll call 5 o'clock on Thursday and 1 at Friday morning. And if we have room on the schedule, we'll get it picked, because number one, it's important to get it picked for that ideal optimum time. And that's kind of when's the optimum time? Well, when the taste ripe and the chemistry comes back right, that's the time. So we'll try and get it off as quickly as we can. We don't always say that, we can't always guarantee it, but I think Greg, if he was on this call, and Jeffrey can attest, we're probably batting 90% on that standpoint.
I'd give you 95% on that.
95.
I think and I'm always amazed at that. How in our contract it's written 72 hours, and Greg maybe will have sampled some of your vineyards that morning, and about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, he's like, I think I'm going to get this and this, and he'll call your brother Mike, and Mike's always very accommodating for us. And that's
jamming out. Sometimes Greg, are we picking it? Well, I'm going out to taste it and test it right now. I'll call you at 3. I'm like, okay, that's all right.
That's a good indication.
The best is put me on the schedule. That's all. Just put me on the schedule, and I'll call you at 3 and let you know. That's always the.
Yeah.
I'll call you at 3. So.
Always been so accommodating for us.
One pressure that isn't seen in Carneros or other coastal cool climate areas in California, that is common in Europe, though, is rain. I mean, rarely have you had to fight off or plan around weather events, but I don't know if that affected any of these three vintages. I know there probably have been weather events, but usually weather events occur in different parts of the growing season than harvest around here.
Yeah, 18 was a dip. So 2018, as we're talking to that, as that's one of the, obviously the vintage we're tasting, we got an inch or inch and a half of rain during the peak of the Chardonnay harvest. That thankfully we got some dry north winds after to dry out the fruit, but we were very, very close to having kind of one of those, you know, really rough botrytis vintages. But it was amazing that we got dry north winds and dried everything out. So rain is, I know we've always, you know, we've been dealing with the, we're gonna call it the F word, right? The fire word, we'll call it the F word, but the last few vintages, but or the last in 17, but rain, it can reap its head. And so, but we've been fortunate. These three vintages, 18, 19, 20, we got some rain here. We always get rain during harvest. It's always, it's going to come in some shape or form. But you know, fortunately, you know, these three vintages didn't affect it from a quality standpoint.
Well, one thing about 18 from my looking up notes is, first off, it was a happy thing over the winter period, getting some rain, right? Because it was a very droughty previous 5 or 6 years. But it never got super hot, did it, in 2018? And there were pretty heavy crops set. So I don't know if you can speak to this specifically at Keyser or the home ranch that affects the landmark wines, but a lot of fruit thinning and fruit dropping were, I think, bywords in 2018, so that you didn't carry such a heavy crop. But as I understand it, the Wente selection was really a successful one in 2018. And what I like about the style of the wine as I'm tasting it again this evening is, you know, there's these wonderful broad aromas, some of which Jeffrey alluded to with the apple notes, stone fruit notes, but that tartness, which I think is so critical to making Chardonnay refreshing and food oriented, which is why I put two of my favorite dishes to have with Chardonnay on the slide. Sauteed scallops with a butter and herb sauce, or planked or roasted salmon, very minimally seasoned. I mean, those are magical flavors. And it's because the acidity cuts through and balances the flavors. That lifted note, I think, really is the case with 2018. And the harvest dates weren't all that variable, although I am going to ask about that 2020 24th of August harvest in a minute, but very consistent across the board with all three vintages, alcohol wise, and there's a consistency of style. It seemed to me 18 is more the French wine connoisseur's vintage, and 19 is more the quote unquote California Chardonnay connoisseur's vintage. And it gives us a little more of that tropicality that I think Jeffrey mentioned. And I think there's a little bit more kind of weight to the wine overall, softer in acid. And I welcome your comments. And again, any questions that come up from our attendees, please, Jen, let me know.
Yes, I did get actually another question that was sent to me directly from Jessica. And her question was actually in regards to the Wente clone. Is it always the Wente clone that is used, or are there other clones on the vineyard?
I think there are other clones in other places.
Yeah. So we have a makeup for the landmark selections of Keyser. There's mostly old Wente. I always laugh. I see large crop loads require thinning and fruit drop. If we ever thin old Wente, because old Wente is hens and chicks, very low producing, right, Jeffrey? We always go out there.
Yeah.
If we ever have to thin Wente, then it must be the biggest crop in the history of
Ever.
ever. Because it's just such low yielding and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, we do have clone 17. Landmarkets, a Keyser clone 17, which is a selection of, I think it's an old cleaned up Wente selection from the Robert Young Vineyard, which is in the 2020 from Home Range. So yeah, I mean, I think everything, pretty much all the Sangiacomos come from Old Wente, correct, Jeffrey? The
Yeah.
vineyard in it.
Yep. Yeah, and then having that consistent source year after year, I think is expressed in these three wines.
Right.
Well, I just laughed because Greg called me actually this week, and he's been looking at these vineyards. You know, obviously, I keep saying 07 is like his little baby because he's been literally getting fruit from the first vintage. And he calls me, he's like, Steve, he's like, Old Wente, the keys are 07, the crops, it's down. I can tell you right, it's below average because he knows it like a book. He can tell he has he's like, everything else looks okay, but the keys are 07.
Yeah.
It's down. But he has a smile on his face when he says that, right? Because he loves it, those little shop berries and stuff. So
like I said earlier, it's a winemaker clone. It's not a grower's clone.
That's right.
Thank God you planted some for us, Steve.
yeah.
I think just to clarify that comment in 2018 about thinning, that was a general comment about the season as opposed to what specifically occurred at.
No, you're right. The clone 4, and that's the other. We have a lot of clone 4. People got to realize a lot of clone 4 is kind of more the bigger producing. Majority of California Chardonnays have clone 4 in it because it's an amazing clone. I mean, it has, you know, it's a bigger producer, but it just makes a really ripe, acid structured wine, and it goes in a lot of Chardonnays. Some of the higher end ones with like the Landmark Reserves and the Sangiacomos and some of our Vineyard Desert, most of it's Old Wente because it matches that style that's needed. But so yeah, the clone 4, that right, Joe, you're right. There was thinning. That was a big year. 19 and 20 were kind of more ideal, very balanced. 20, both of them were kind of on the lighter side.
Right. And, you know, I think with 19, to me, it maybe has turned out to be maybe the deepest of the three wines in terms of delivery of flavor. And again, that little tropical note. But again, it's very food oriented. I'd welcome almost any lighter meat off the grill, up to and including a pork dish, maybe. But you know, I think there's enough heft to it. And then with 2020, of course, the F word came up, didn't it? Not so much affecting Chardonnay harvest, but I found it interesting that some of the fruit was harvested on the 24th of August and then another couple of weeks later. And I don't know if that reflects the sources in the two different vineyard blocks, or if that's a matter of timing around other events that were matters of concern during that growing season at the end.
I think it speaks of the crop load, and looking at Keys Block 0782 for 2020, the last day we sampled it was August 21st, and that was Greg. Because I always put initials of who's done the sampling, and it was Greg who was in there. And I had estimated 11 tons, and we got a little bit under 8 tons. It did come in on August 24th. And another fact that Greg loves about this particular vineyard block is it's always the first fruit that we receive at the winery for Chardonnays. And because it is so important, it's treated with kid gloves, and with our interns and our winemaking team here, it's a big deal. I mean, it kicks off harvest for us, and it's a big deal. Always exciting.
I think that precision in 2020 means it's got a long way to go. Resting in bottle. I think Chardonnay is a variety that does have an interesting cellar life if you give it a chance. Great White Burgundy certainly does. Great Blanc de Blanc Champagne certainly does. And I think really well-made Chardonnay from great sources, if the acidity is there and you've been delicate with the oak, you can be really expressive of flavor for 5, 8, 10 years in some cases and have an interesting wine. And I think most of us, of course, don't drink our Chardonnays at 10 years old, but it's a rewarding experience if you can stash away a bottle or two. I'm sure you've done it, both of you. I know I have, and I come back to something, and sometimes it's disappointing, but more often it's fascinating where the flavors go.
Yes.
If you don't mind my interjection, I just had a comment off of what Jeffrey was just saying. I had the pleasure of working for the cellar team during the 2020 harvest. I was one of the interns, and it was a fascinating experience getting to see all of the grapes come in on these half-ton fermenter boxes, and seeing the grapes essentially straight off of the vine, picked the night before. It's 7 a.m. and we're there ready to work. And these grapes are just showing up, and they're fascinating. We got to try a couple of them essentially right off of the vine, and it was a really exciting time, especially getting to see the first Chardonnay harvest we had brought in. It was quite the experience, and with the Sangiacomo name, I mean, what more could you ask for? It was a fascinating experience for sure. It was fun.
Well, what's your favorite block? Do you remember what your favorite lot was? Caroline, I'm putting you on the spot.
I know. Well, you know what? I might have to side with Greg a little bit, because he kind of put the emphasis on, what was it? Clone 7 was his favorite. Was that right?
Block 7.
Block 7.
Block
Thank
7.
you very much.
Yeah. Block
I
7.
think he kind of put the emphasis on it, and made sure we all knew this was his favorite. But yeah, it was a wonderful experience all around.
Did he make you roll out the red carpet for it, or what? What happened when it?
Oh
when it
my
came-
gosh. I mean, we definitely got a little bit of a lesson in Sangiacomo history. I fully thought that it was Sangiacomo. I was very wrong about that. I was glad I was corrected. But no, I mean, honestly, those were the most tart and fun ones to get to try. I thought those had the most amazing profile in the actual grape itself versus like in the bottle. But yeah, it was wonderful. I loved it. I have pictures, like selfies of me with the grapes. It's great.
We should have had them in the presentation.
I'll bring one up. I'll send myself one. 1 second.
There you go.
Well, we're open to questions, comments. I don't know if we have more specific vintage difference, since it is a vertical tasting. We can kick that around a little bit more.
Yeah, I love the one thing I think you mentioned earlier, Joseph, and even Jeffrey, the freshness of the wines and the ageability of Chardonnay. I mean, I still, even these Chardonnays are tasting delicious, and I mean, I can, pair them with anything right now, but they still have a youngness and freshness to them, which shows the ageability of them. And I'm with you. Some of these, put a couple away just to taste them in a couple of years, just to see the evolution. It's so fun to go back.
Yeah, they're keepers.
Yeah.
Hard to say which one might go the longest. I mean, I'm not sure if I could guess that. Maybe the freshest would be the one I would select for the longest period, but that's saying that tasting tonight.
Yeah.
To be continued.
Yeah, that's right. We'll
to be
tasting
continued.
again in a couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really, really part of the joy and the fun of having not only Sangiacomo, but some of our other single vineyard wines, and going back and looking at 2013. Because I started here in 2012 and looking at 13 and 14 and 15, and going back and trying to remember, what was the weather like that year, and then realizing it doesn't matter. Whatever happened that year is in this bottle, and it's for our enjoyment right now.
Yeah, even though you have all the data somewhere in a computer or something, or maybe a ledger, I don't know, but
it's a spreadsheet somewhere. I'm great on creating data, not so good on data management. The file is out there somewhere.
yeah, once it's in the bottle, you don't need the data.
Well, sometimes. One thing I did want to bring up, and I kind of missed the opportunity earlier, is when Steve was talking about their sustainability and the efforts that they make to try and do the right thing, for the next generation. You have this multi-generational family, and they're very humble. I remember my first meeting with the Sangiacomos is when I was working at another winery, and the owner wanted to get some more fruit from Carneros region because we had a vineyard down there. And Steve, I don't even know if you'll remember this or not, but I came with Stephen Dominichelli and Sarah Quieter. It must have been 2006 or 2007. And you were so gracious with Mike, and I remember Buck coming in and saying hi to us, and you gave us this great presentation and this history about the vineyards. And you know, at the end, we were all super excited, and you're like, well, unfortunately, we don't have any fruit available this year. And it was this letdown that, oh my God, I really, you know, as a viticulturalist and grower relations for that brand, I really wanted to have the opportunity to work with the Sangiacomos. And as we left, we all discussed what a great family, what great dedication. And when I came to Landmark in 2012, I found out that we sourced a fair amount of Sangiacomo fruit, and I was so excited. You know, it's like, finally I get to work with this family. And you're a very humble family. In 2009, you got some recognition from the Sonoma County Farm Bureau as the outstanding young farmer. And you took it as humbly as you and your family take everything. And in 2020, the Sonoma County Farm Bureau awarded the Sangiacomo Family Vineyards the Luther Burbank Conservation Award. So I want to applaud you in all of your efforts for the planet and for your kids, and what you and Sangiacomo Family Vineyards do and your impact on us at Landmark.
I most definitely want to echo that. My degree in college was natural resource management and sustainability. And a lot of that was the combination of the two, and learning how to grow crops and while being forward thinking and sustainable at the same time. It's been really interesting getting to learn about it. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Jeffrey. And yeah, I mean, look, as I said earlier, we've been, this year in August, we celebrate 95 years farming in Sonoma County. And so we love agriculture. It's in our DNA. Trust me, there's a lot of times we don't love agriculture when it rains during harvest and all those other things, but it's in our DNA, and it's a true testament. Sonoma County is built on agriculture. It's back to Luther Burbank. It's our foundation of who we are as a county, and we're doing everything we can to continue the tradition. And we'll fight until they don't want us here, agriculture here in Sonoma County any longer. But hopefully that, you know, doesn't happen for a long, long time. So our industry does so many great things for this county, and it plays a wonderful role, and we just want to be part of it.
Amen.
Amen.
Fantastic wines. You know, Chardonnay is the greatest white wine variety on earth. I know many of my sommelier friends might debate me, but because it has this sort of structure, this ability to demonstrate place consistently, and it reflects personality, I think it makes it a really fascinating wine, and appreciate the dedication. You can taste these wines and many others at Landmark's 2 different tasting rooms, which I mentioned earlier on the map. One at our Kenwood home, and then the other at the Hop Kiln facility out in Russian River. Jennifer, who is instrumental in putting this event together, thank you. And that is her email in case you want to, you know, buy some wine, maybe. She's the one to know.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Joe. And I'm excited to say, while you guys have been talking, we have a handful of more questions.
Oh, I didn't see those. Okay.
Yes, for some reason, it's all going directly to me. So I must have pressed something. But Sally had a few questions. First of all, she wanted to know, Joe, is the background that you have up on your Zoom, is that a Corton vineyard?
Exactly. Somebody should win a prize for that. That's the hill, the Bois de Corton. So the wooded area on the top of Corton in Burgundy, just north of Beaune, and one of the greatest vineyards for Chardonnay in the world, Corton Charlemagne. which we all try to emulate in the Sonoma County Chardonnay business in a different way, though. Every place has its virtues, and I think Cordon Charlemagne can often have a honeyed character, a lot of that peachy fruit and appley character. You know, and I just put it in there as sort of an iconic vineyard, but that's what it is. It has nothing to do with Landmark. And if we were sourcing fruit for Landmark from Cordon Charlemagne, it would be $150 a bottle.
Wow.
If.
Steve Heron has a question as well. He wants to know from the three of you, which one is your personal favorite and why?
Mm.
Mm.
Well, my personal favorite right now is the 18 because that's the one that's in front of me.
By default, the 19 is my favorite because it's in front of me.
Yeah, I tasted the 19, all three of them earlier in the week, and they all had virtues. The 19 to me had a little more, as I said earlier, more depth, but that isn't always necessarily what you need, particularly at the table. So, I mean, I could see the slightly tartar texture of 18 and 20 winning out with a plate of oysters or scallops, or, you know, a lobster with drawn butter, or a nice piece of steamed fish. 19 to me is the most pleasurable to drink by itself. That's what I would say.
Well, I love the 20. I mean, I love them all. Don't get me wrong. But if I had a nudge of 20 for me, there's something about that vintage, is even with our own wines and other clients' wines, it's something unique. They're just starting to be released at 20. So, but I mean, I can drink the 18 and 19, you know, just it's hand in hand. So side by side.
They're still young wines, all three.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, awesome. And so Sally and John Seamack say they actually prefer the 2018. They think it has the largest body, most tropical pineapple notes.
Huh.
And they want to know when you would suggest the 2020 optimum age. When we're to lay it down, I'm guessing, when would it be optimum to drink?
Boy, that's always a hard thing, and it's a matter of preference. I think it'll be interesting for a good 8 to 10 years, really developing a little more texture, maybe losing a little acidity over time, gaining some color, a little more golden after, say, 7, 8 years. I think it'll still be a taut wine, T-A-U-T, it'll have great texture and great firmness. And I think that's why it might be the best aging wine of the three.
And then
That's a
one,
guess.
excellent. And then one more question, and I think this is for Steve. Have you considered ISO 14001 certification for the winery, the environmental management STD?
Repeat that. I'm sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, sorry, I didn't write it totally out. We were just wondering, you know, with the sustainability, if you've also considered, it's ISO 14001 certification for the winery, and that's the environmental management standard, similar to a quality management standard. We're starting to see more wineries pick up interest in this.
Well,
Just
and
curious.
we're auditors to that, so
Yeah.
it's self-serving in a way, but still.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So when I say 99%, that the vineyards are, not wineries. So I'm with you. There is some momentum with wineries to kind of take that next step, and really, we have a handful that are doing that as well. So that's it's a different process, but I'm with you. It all goes hand in hand for sure.
I think more of the winery than vineyards.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of
Yeah, I thought that those were about production standards and
Could be
energy use and
making
such.
wine, too.
Yeah, they deal with basically making sure you comply, and they're really part of it is getting awards, getting sustainability awards. The whole idea there is to basically differentiate yourself from other people from an environmental standpoint, which a lot of people, they will, if I have a choice, same price range, and wine's similar, I'll go with the ISO guy. I do that with when I buy products even. So, you have to be in the mix, of course. But and the other thing, you mentioned the Wente clone. I went to UC Davis, and we studied a lot about viticultureology. And I guess I didn't realize Chardonnay started in the Livermore Valley. That was the first place they planted it. The the Concannon vineyards over there, which I think is long gone or still around. And then the Wente. So they're kind of the spearhead of Chardonnay in California. So it's kind of interesting kind of history, back in I'm talking, the 20s and 30s or even earlier. So there's a real legacy of Chardonnay in California. And I totally agree with you guys, even though the noble grapes also are Riesling and Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay takes on the character of the area, how you make it. It's probably the most expressive of all the grapes. I totally agree with you. It's the barrel, everything. So Chardonnay, even though it starts off kind of good, it can become great in a winemaker's hand. But of course, just like any good meal, you got to start with good ingredients. So unless you get really good grapes coming in, you can't make a great meal with crappy ingredients, but you can make a crappy meal with good ingredients. So just go from there.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, right vines in the right place, picked at the right time, and then not messed around with too much. That's the way to do it.
So we have one more question, and this is from Guy, and hopefully I can pronounce this correctly. He was questioning did the 2018 have a hint of botrytis or just more hang time?
I didn't catch that in my aromatic assessment of the wine and the couple of times I've had it. So I could be wrong. I don't know if that was the case. I kind of doubt it. But maybe Jeffrey knows more.
Well, yeah, I was just looking at the sampling data, and I think hang time might be the answer. For that year, we had 8 data points of sampling, and probably add one more to that, Greg's last sampling, where with the 20 vintage, everything happened so quickly, we only have 5 data points of sampling. So I think with the cooler summer that we had in 2018, I think it did lend to longer hang time.
Thank you. Okay.
Any other questions out there, Jen, or from the audience?
I think I have not seen anything pop up. Any other questions?
Everybody's steaming their lobsters now.
No, looking at those, hearing all of that, looking at all those pictures of the food is maybe.
Oh yes, the butter for the lobsters.
Well, I really appreciate Joe, Jeffrey, Steve. Thank you so much for taking the time out of, I know all 3 of you have incredibly busy schedules, and sharing all of your knowledge with all of us. And of course, Caroline, thank you for working so hard on putting together this amazing deck. And most importantly, thank you to everybody who's participated and who is supporting Landmark. And just a quick parting piece of information. If you do want to restock your wine, whether it is Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, I think Chardonnay is perfect, especially for the weekend coming up. For non-members, we offer a 20% or 20% discount for wine, and for members, we will offer a 30% discount to purchase wine, and you can purchase it online. Just use the virtual Psalm 22 promo code, and if you do have any questions, or you want to just purchase the wine directly from me, I am more than happy to help you with that as well. So thank you guys so much. Really grateful for everything, and I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Yes, indeed. Thank you
Thank
for the
you.
Thank
opportunity.
you all so much.
Appreciate the opportunity. Cheers to Sangiacomo Family Vineyards.
Cheers.
Steve and your
100%.
family. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Thank
Mark.
you.
I got the girl